Hello world. How to restore the Great Giza Pyramid back to function? Well, let's take the structure we have there in Giza today. And the first thing we want to do is lob that nice antenna that we retrofitted onto the top of it off of it. And what this is going to allow is for standard everyday wind blowing back and forth to have brush discharge static electricity, which will deposit itself on the surface of the structure. Then that will dissipate, just like it would if it was brushing back and forth against a tree or on the side of a hill. But there's a ring at the 35th level that will quarantine it to the surface of the structure until it gets enough power, voltage, amperage to jump over that gap. And because of the lack of the top, it will quarantine itself and basically turn into a big Van de Graaff generator. This would compensate for the stories back in the 1800s where they would go up there with their Leyden jars and do experiments. Their hair would stand up on end just like it would if you had a balloon with static electricity. Static electricity is something they really didn't know or understand, but they could feel the phenomena that it shows, the way it reveals itself. Well, anyway, in itself that's not going to do anything. You're just going to get a big Van de Graaff generator of static electricity hanging out there in the middle of the desert. But if we were then take the same structure exactly as it sits and fill the outside of it, build a moat, and fill the outside of it to just above the 19th layer, below the 35th layer, maybe about a third of the way up into the Queen's, the elevation that the Queen's chamber is at. I like to call that the Ark chamber. We'll get to that shortly. What this will allow is the water to flow through the loosely fit rocks that they had to break through, the one that hid the entrance, and would saturate the system. Now, the way it actually is going to work when we're all said and done is we're going to have a double bubbler system there, which will, actually, it does go down lower for a reason, and might as well draw it properly. Double bubbler system there, which will then maintain the elevation of the waters within the system to be just below the level of the hallway, which will separate a pool within the system from a pool on the outside of the system. And there's going to be a couple of other air gaps and stuff within the system as well, because this is very well engineered. When it saturates the system, you're not going to get too much of anything, except for when we append some of the other structures, and we understand that the entire subterranean structure here is in a big limestone bath, with the exception of two locations. Those locations would be the pit within the grotto and the pit within the subterranean chamber. And through manipulation of other, natural phenomenon, we're going to turn this one into the anode and this one into the cathode. Now, this is actually going to do some work here as the oxygen comes up into the room, which is saturated with water, and works its way out. The way that the bottom there is made with the little tooth, this being this blow up of this area here. This will allow a oxygen bubble to form on the roof here, and when it bubbles out, it's going to create what's called a water hammer effect. Now, evidence of that water hammer effect can be seen in photos of the 1800s, where you can see piles of dirt in a nice pattern along that hallway. That would show the frequency and wavelength of that water hammer. The way that they keep the system from flushing out is because you've got a nice 12 to 18 foot section there with a stucco type appearance, which has an elevation that goes down about an inch lower than the top on the other side. So any liquid, no matter what it is within here, if it got down a little lower, it's going to bubble out to the other side. It's not going to actually let itself drop. And because it's actually got water pushing down, what it does is the gases in here are allowed to escape through different steps of the system, but never allowing the gas itself to break from the ceiling to, the water can't fall. It's kind of trapped there at that elevation. Very interesting and unique setup. Now, this dead end shaft, they don't like to point out, is actually rib shaped, kind of like an inchworm or a caterpillar. Now, what and why, I'm not 100% sure. I think we're either getting cavitation or some other effect as this water hammer echoes through the system. But we'll really have to address that when we model it. The hydrogen is going to get caught in the grotto. And in the grotto, it's very uniquely shaped so that the room kind of has where one section goes above the other section. So any liquid within that room, because of the way it's shaped, is going to act as like a lock. It can't go too low and it can't go any higher. It's kind of locked there like a pressure bubble, kind of like the same way we're going to do here on the way in to maintain the water level at a lower elevation. This will lock it in there, but will allow the gas to seep out through the holes that are drilled in the southern wall, according to the tomb dogma, to hide scrolls. Yes, you're going to hide scrolls in something which is saturated with water. That's fine. They could tell it was saturated water. You could see the water wear, which is why they called it a well shaft and a well and blah, blah, blah. They just don't really like to point out that if you saturate it with water, there's some magic that can be done. Anyway, there are holes drilled in the southern wall. Oh, and that whole limestone area is actually across the bottom there as well. And then everything else is supposedly rock from there up. And I'll tell you, it's fill and boulders and stuff on the inside, and a lot of sand as well, because they've drilled through areas and found sand, but that's a story for a different video. Anyway, that hydrogen gets piped up to a top. It actually comes in above what they like to call the king's chamber. I like to call that the combustion chamber. And it comes into there where they find the seeds and the shells and dust, which are impurities from the water that are brought up at the updraft. Get deposited as the gas comes into the room, and that gas actually, the way the pressures work, gets pushed down and comes up through the bottom of the king's chamber, where there's a hole about 10 feet deep that goes down there that they can't account for. It's in the northwest corner. Currently has a piece of metal across the top of it. You can stick your finger in there and lift it up if they don't have it bolted down, and you can step on it and hear it's definitely metal. And they don't really have a way you can get a camera in there anymore, but I have photos on the website, photos.giza.ws, of people who took pictures of it in the 90s when it was much more exposed. And, well, that's beside the point. So that's going to be your flashback arrestor. That's the hydrogen is going to bubble up into the room from there. And from there, you're not going to get too much of anything, except for when you look at the static electricity. We're now going to utilize it for phase one. The conduit that comes in from the south side is shaped in such a way that the tip of it actually comes right out, if I were to draw straight lines, right out from the perfect symmetry within the room. And with the static electricity within the room and the perfect symmetry, this is going to be the anomaly that allows for a spark. It's set back about 5 inches, and when you look at it from the front, that would be the opening. Now, it's also oval in the back, and that comes important because what we're going to have here is just air from the outside. Air being 78% nitrogen, and then you've got 21% oxygen, and then 1% CO2. And all that is getting sucked into the system and burnt together with the hydrogen, and primarily would become water. Water, that stuff, H2O. H2O, something no one, if you said that 20 years ago, people would look at you like they didn't know what you were talking about unless you were like at Harvard or Princeton or something of that nature. H2O was something no one even knew about. Who knew that 2 gases were inside of the stuff we drink? That's a whole other story. We'll get into that later. Anyway, this water would saturate the system, run down to the system, and pool down here, and run down to the bottom and do it again. Now we're going to add a little bit to it because they did some damage on the way in, and when you add to it, you're going to see some of the things that are going to happen. One of them is we're going to put a wall about 1/3 of the way into what they like to call the antechamber, the pre-chamber. I call it one of the other flashback arresters. This will allow that water to pool within the system. And when it pools within the system, because of the way this is shaped, as the water works its way up, it's going to cut off the air intake. As it recedes, it's going to give off more air intake. Now, there's a lot more that's involved as far as the elevations, and that all these elevations are actually keyed into that box which is in the room, but you really have to pay attention and at least be aware of the pyramid matrix as taught by Carl Monk, and you can go to thecode.giza.ws or thecode.greatgizapyramid.com, and it will take you to his videos. And if you know of it, you see this stuff like Roman numerals. You can see the Roman numerals, and then you apply them to what it's saying. They are using physical structures to dictate information. But only if you know what they're trying to relay can you really see and verify this. But let's continue. This water will choke that off. Now what it also does is there are 3 unique elevations where this inlet is. There's a break in the rock right there. On the north side of the structure, there's the conduit which is just below that same break in the rock. And in the conduit that they like to call the Thieves' Tunnel, which goes west into the wall from the pre-chamber, is just above that. Now, this conduit goes up and actually ties into that conduit because, luckily, back when we were allowed to have fun, somebody was nice enough to take one of those 2 million candle power flashlights and shine it into that conduit. And then a gentleman inside of here was able to verify that he could see the light coming from there. What this tells us is that the structure within here is going to be using this conduit like a tea kettle uses its little blowhole. And it's going to be blowing the steam up into this section. And as that happens, it's going to get condensation. Now all this condensation is going to be born in a higher than the condensation next to it static environment. And eventually this is going to pull the static electricity both through condensation and dripping and just the ambient steam and how nature pours a vacuum is going to spread this static electricity out into the system. Now, a couple of things occur. The way that it always maintains a barrier between one phase and the next, and that barrier constantly keeps growing in conjunction with how much the potential of that phase of the system can handle, up until it gets down into this section where the potential is enough that a spark is going to generate from within the niche of what they like to call the Queen's Chamber. I like to call this the arc chamber, and will arc over to the crack that they found, the electrical crack that was in the southern wall. Again, we couldn't see an electrical crack because we didn't even know what a battery was. We had the Baghdad battery hanging in there, and we were calling it a vase for years until we found out what a battery was, and then you hide that in the basement, out of sight, out of mind. And this crack in the wall, well, the electrical scarring, we cut through to find the conduit that was behind it. That is where the static electricity was actually tapped out of the room. It was brought down into the room, or into the whole system, by the way that there are ribs on the wall will allow the water to condensate, come down, and drip. And it's constantly dripping. All that dripping is pulling the static electricity down into the system, pulling it down past that 35 level barrier that it can't get below on the outside of the system. Now, that may be more visual than functional, because really what they're doing is they're just creating the environment there so that they can have the potential as high as possible. And I don't really think they physically had to bring it down that low, but they did that because, like I said, there's communication within the system that you don't really understand unless you're looking for it and understand the system. Like the way the tail itself that goes into the niche has layers across the bottom. Those layers key up with certain points where the layer changes. You notice there's also, it keys in with the niche on the outside. That all is relational information. One layer, follow the pattern, look at what it relates to. You notice that will be the pressure or wavelength or inverse of the gas or whatever lock that particular level deals with. Now this whole system, just like how steam creates pressure, steam engines back in the day, all this condensation is actually going to be creating a vacuum. Now, this vacuum is going to cause a lighter than ambient pressure atmosphere, so the situation within here is going to be a negative atmospheric pressure. And that will also help to, in some ways, suck up the base of the water, which is why I think it has steps, because the more vacuum that's occurring, the higher the water level within the system will be, and that will be in inverse to the water level would be at just 1-to-1 atmospheric pressure. So we are completely skewing and changing the environment within the structure, and something is generated, I believe, more than just electricity. I think they're, well, nature will tell us. Building a model or getting CAD, or someone who understands the environment and says, hey, you know, that's a perfect environment for creating ammonia. Ammonia, remember that? That's NH3, NH3. This way we got H2O there, NH3. Well, we got an abundance of hydrogen, and as we burn off all the oxygen within that room to create the water, we're going to still have plenty of hydrogen and plenty of nitrogen hanging around. So there may be other compounds that we are creating within this structure because, well, the other two structures aren't there for no reason. And when you understand what this is doing, the other two structures kind of are all at play with it, because the other two structures are part of what aids in the separation of these gases. You don't just get a positive and a negative flow out of thin air. That's what the other structures are for, and the conduits that litter underneath the Great Giza Pyramid Plateau. This system, I think, is quite obvious when you see and understand what's going on. We understand electricity today. If you disagree with me, you're welcome to it, but whatever the case is, I think I'm way, way past the tomb dogma.